Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. You can check out new episodes of the show every Tuesday and Thursday at 2 p.m. If you missed an episode or want to get more information about the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Orly Zeewy. She's a brand architect. Orly, welcome to the show. I'm excited to finally get you recorded. We talked months ago, and we kind of share a lot of the same views on some things, and you're doing quite a bit of stuff. So maybe before we kind of get into exactly what you're doing, let's get to know you a little bit better and kind of cover your background.
Yeah, happy to, Kevin, and thank you for having me on the show. I'm actually really excited. So let's see. I guess I think first of all, I have to preface this by saying that I'm clearly an entrepreneur because I like to do a lot of different things at the same time, and I've been doing that really since I was in school. So I started out as a fine artist, and then I trained as a graphic designer because I realized that as much as I loved art, I actually preferred solving other people's problems and not my own.
Interesting. So
what graphic design? Yeah.
Sorry, what kind of got you passionate about art? Was there something kind of growing up, or you just naturally kind of good at it, or?
Yes. Yes and yes.
Okay.
So I've been drawing since before I could write.
Interesting.
And I grew up all over the world, and my parents literally made it their personal mission to take me to every single museum. Like, I've been to literally all the great museums.
Really?
In Europe.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So Prado, and I've been in France and Spain, and I've seen Chagall's, and I've seen originals of a lot of things. I've been to the Louvre, and I've been to all these places. And growing up, it just was what we did, and it never occurred to me that it was unusual at all. That was my background. And then one other thing that I think really influenced me is that my mother was actually an art rep, and she represented artists, and we got to know some of them personally. And as a result, I have some really beautiful pieces in my home, and I think just being surrounded with art all the time just really impacted me.
Okay, no, that's awesome. Like, I think like a lot of people don't visit those places in a lifetime, right? And the fact that you got that early on is awesome, right? And that's actually quite fascinating. So, what made you kind of make that transition from kind of fine art into being like a graphic designer?
So we're looking now. We're early '80s, late '70s, early '80s, and graphic design at that time was still, people really didn't know what it was.
Sure.
And it was still fairly under the radar. Like today, everybody's a graphic designer, or everybody just uses the word design, I think, as shorthand.
Sure.
But back then, I really didn't know much about it, but I love the idea of, at the time, it was this discipline, very process-oriented, with also this very much a fine art focus. So this is really how I learned to think like a designer, which, of course, fast forward 30 years later, and in fact, I'm using all of the tools that I learned as a graphic design student to do the work that I'm doing now, which is really facilitating alignment workshops and actually doing design thinking workshops.
Okay, interesting. The thing that fascinates me kind of about your background is, like, a lot of that was probably done, like, we have all these fancy computers now and software and whatnot, and in a lot of cases, it's so much easier than it was kind of back then, right? Because in a lot of cases, you guys were probably, mailing stuff maybe across the country or to different cities?
Yeah.
And a lot of it wasn't done digital at all, correct?
Oh, there was no digital.
Sure, no.
Digital. And, but actually what I remember, it's funny that thinking back on this, and you don't really see it. I think one of the things I wanted to mention is you really don't get a sense of how you got here until you're further along, I think, in your career, and then you can look back and you can say, oh, yeah, I can sort of see how that dot connects to this dot, but at the time, you're just kind of doing what you're doing, and you're not really thinking about connecting dots.
Sure.
And one of the things that really struck me, and I was thinking about this the other day, I think I was trying to tell one of my students, about the dinosaur days, before computers. And, it's like you're talking about, another planet. But at the time, we used to do what were called mechanicals. Are you familiar with that term?
Yeah, totally. But for those who aren't, do you want to just mention that quick?
Yeah, just because I think it goes to your point about digital versus old school or versus traditional.
Sure.
So because we didn't have computers, it meant that we as designers had to become craftspeople.
Totally.
So I learned literally how to put together a book using boards, which were illustration boards, using tape and pens and different kind. I guess at the time I think we were using wax and using typesetters, which are almost obsolete now.
Sure.
And I got it to the point where I could literally move a period on a line of text with an X-Acto knife.
Yeah, that's awesome. But I think that's the thing that's kind of lost these days, and is like people these days, and even myself included, it's really hard to truly understand the mediums nowadays. And even in the digital space, like there's so many different things to consider now, and it's hard. And I almost feel bad for kids kind of coming out of school these days, because it's like the web alone is so complicated. And then, if you want to be just doing web stuff, you can. And then there's mobile. And then if you want to do print stuff, and yeah, they're all design mediums, but how you need to think about it and the understanding of each medium is totally different from each other.
Yeah, and then of course you throw in social media.
Totally.
And it's crazy out there. I mean, you have social media now. You've got more than 500 sites, 500 platforms, and it's growing all the time. And people are so overwhelmed. And I'm thinking about, back to your question around designers today, I think not only do they have to navigate these rather complex platforms, but they also have to figure out, I have a portfolio. How do I show that to people? What does a job search look like for a student getting out of school? I mean, we didn't have any of that. It was more like there were these established studios back then, design studios, I was basically, it was in a way it was easier and harder, if you know what I mean.
Totally, yep.
Right. So, and I think I will say that I think my claim to fame as a graphic design student is that I went to school with, oh my gosh, now of course I'm going to completely blank out on it. But he's become a very famous designer in New York, Michael. Oh my gosh, wow. Okay, it'll come back to me.
Sure. No, it's all good.
But anyway, Michael Beirut, sorry.
There you go.
Sorry, Michael, if you're listening to this, I'm really sorry about that I had a little blip there. He was a great guy, by the way. But he sort of did. I think the path that at the time we all kind of aspire to, which is you find like the best design studio in New York, which is what he did. He got a job there, and now he's a partner at Pentagram, which is one of the top design or brand agencies in the world.
Sure.
Actually. So, but now I think with I think what's been lost is, because we have access to everything, it's hard to know what to focus on. And in a way, the onus, I think, is more on students to figure out what they want to do, because the possibilities are so much more than they were when we were in school. Graphic design was it was a scripted kind of experience, I think. And but today, you have to know so many different platforms. You have to understand, how to use Photoshop versus how you're using in design, or, when you do a PowerPoint now, you have Prezi, you've got all these different tools, and the tools are amazing, by the way. I am not suggesting for a moment that we go back to the days when we didn't have these tools. Quite the contrary. But I think what happens is, and I'm thinking back on a class that I taught 2 graphic design students about typography, and it's like, to them, you get on the computer, and we all have this, right? You go even in Word, right? You look in that, and there's a typeface, and you have whatever. I mean, I have probably 1,000 typefaces, but let's say even if you have like whatever comes with your software, and then there's auto, Well,
Sure.
auto is a completely meaningless. It's a meaningless thing. There is no such thing as auto. The way the typesetting evolved was back in the printing press days, where people actually, typesetters actually used they used lead, and they actually had. This is why it's called leading, because
Sure.
they would use units of lead between each line of text. Now that all of that's lost now, and so if you understand, I think if you understand where things come from, it gives you an appreciation of kind of how we got here, and I think it gives you more. I think it feels like you're part of something bigger than just you doing a poster or a business card.
No, I totally agree with you on that, and I think it is a good thing. I think in kind of any industry that you kind of, if you really want to push something forward, you kind of need to know where it comes from and where it's been, and kind of how to use the good things from those different kind of eras to push things forward, right? And I think it also
Yeah.
helps you understand the mediums a lot better, and then even maybe help predict kind of where they're going to go, or you know maybe even be part of where they're going to go.
Yeah. I think it also gives you a sense of history that puts you in a time frame, in a
Sure.
timeline. It creates, I think, more of a sense of respect for the industry. And what I have found, I mean, now, of course, I'm not really doing design very much anymore. I'm really focused more on the content component. But even there, it's like, where did all this come from? Where even the word content? How about proofing? There's this whole lost art of actually proofing a page of text, and I had to learn that because that's how we set up type. It wasn't just like we put it in design and then just formatted. We had to figure out like how many lines of type there were going to be, and what font, what size it needs to be. We had to understand the difference between text size versus display versus a poster, and how different fonts had different fonts had different functions in communications. And it was really about learning how to communicate. And I think that, and interestingly, actually, to me, is that as we become more digitally sophisticated, we have lost the art of communication, which
Totally.
I think is really ironic.
No, I totally agree. So you're a brand architect and you teach,
Correct.
but for people that don't really know what a brand architect is, do you want to maybe kind of cover exactly kind of what you do at your company?
Sure. So I decided to go out as a consultant. I actually had just to finish up sort of my background. So,
Sure.
After school, I freelanced. I did a lot of different things. I worked at the Philadelphia Museum of Art for a couple of years, and I actually had my own design and marketing communications firm for 14 years.
Okay.
And so we did very complex. I had a team, and we did very complex projects that lasted for years, and did everything from literally coming up with the content and developing programs and then communicating about that. And then about 14 years ago, I decided to do, so I actually wrote myself a mission statement, which is something, by the way, I would really recommend to people who are thinking about going out on their own, because it helps clarify kind of what matters to you and kind of how you want to approach things. So for me, was that the three-prong idea of having, I was gonna do the public speaking, which up to then I'd actually never done public speaking, but I somehow, I don't know, it just seemed like a good sort of next step for me, because public speaking is, for me, business development. It's how I get clients, and then the teaching for me is something, first of all, that I love to do because I've always done that, but it's also just gives me credibility, helps me find out what's happening like right now and really stay on the pulse of things. And then finally the consulting, which is, really that's my day job, I guess. And as a brand architect, what I mean by that is, just like an architect who designs buildings is also very well versed in how to actually, not just how to design buildings, but how to make sure those buildings don't fall down, how to create a whole naming, like a whole structure of, in this case, of visual architecture, if you will, making sure that that it works together, and then they work with the interior designer. That they have to work with construction management folks to figure out, what materials they're going to use. So I kind of took that approach when I went out on my own and decided to do this consulting, and sort of thought, so I think to me, a brand is everything. It's everything you touch, it's everything you see, and more importantly, it's everything you experience.
Sure.
And I just really like the idea of an architect because it felt to me like it really also spoke to kind of my background and my kind of the breadth and depth of the experience I've had up till now.
Yeah, no, I think that's awesome, and I think you touched on something that's really interesting, and I think a lot of people forget is like the physical side of a brand, and kind of like what you just mentioned, kind of like how things feel and touch, and kind of their office space and anything else, right? Where
Exactly.
it's kind of like on and offline. And I get people usually specialize in kind of, just the web or mobile or both, or, but there's not a lot of people that kind of do web and print, at least not really that well, because they're almost like totally different mindsets, right? And I think that's super important.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny that you say that because I had a bit of an aha moment, and I remember this about 15 years ago when I could have actually gone into web design. I have, years and years of print design. I really do know how to get something on press. I know what you need to do. I know how to change colors and what you do if you add this color to that color. So I'm pretty well versed there. But when the web came on board, what I realized, and I'd like to think that I was really that visionary. I don't really believe I was. I think it was more like I just really didn't want to have to learn a whole new set of skills.
Sure.
But as it turns out, I did anyway because I have actually done web design. But
right.
I prefer to leave it to the experts. I need to learn enough. And I think this goes back to this architect approach, is that I understand enough about it so I can communicate to someone, but not so that I can micromanage them. So for me, I need to really truly understand how we communicate in these different platforms. And to me, it really comes down to the ease of communication. And one of the things that I realized, when everybody who was a designer, what was happening then, so designers, when the web came on, is designers either stopped being designers or they went into the digital space and they went into online design.
Sure.
But, and still, of course, there's still print, although, it's definitely much smaller than it used to be. But for me, it was about the thinking that went behind it, and nobody was even, design thinking was, we're talking like 15 years ago. Nobody was talking about design thinking then. But for some reason, for me, because I've had this really incredible, incredible base of learning from being at Cincinnati College of Design, which is, by the way, one of the top design programs, and I really want to give them a plug here because it's just an amazing program, and they really teach you how to think.
Sure, that's
and
awesome.
I realized, so for me, it was really about what do I do next? If I'm not going to become a web designer, then what do I really want to do? And which is why I did this mission statement. But for me, it was I really wanted to understand how people communicated. And so it was, very clear to me that to do that, I needed to be a strategic partner to business. And that's really kind of when things took off for me, is when I started I pivoted. I've actually pivoted several times since then, but now, how I kind of position myself is that what I do is I help businesses and organizations align their vision with relevant and also strategic marketing so they can connect to their ideal customers to help them find them, buy them, and refer them.
Okay.
That's really what I do.
Interesting. I think you brought up a couple points there that I think are worth kind of maybe stressing or kind of elaborating on a little bit. And the first one to me was the fact that you kind of you pivoted. You also changed kind of your career direction. Like you said, you didn't want to move into the web, and like I think the fact that you're kind of constantly evolving, and obviously you still are passionate about design and whatnot, and you might not always do it on every project, if maybe at all anymore, but you still are learning the new mediums, even if you're not actually doing the design on them. And I think that's super important, right? Because
Yeah.
The more you understand about the entire process of whatever you're working on, the better, even if you only do like a small chunk of that, right? And I think that's the one thing that I've found personally in my career, kind of being like a digital designer and creative director at a software company, is that a lot of people and even clients and even outside designers that we work with at companies sometimes is, you're doing this mobile thing, but they don't really understand mobile, or they're trying to argue with you about how Android should be designed when they're an iOS user and they've never actually used an Android device. And you're like, well, you kind of need to, like, you can't argue about something if you don't understand the medium that we're arguing about, right?
Right. Yeah, you know what? You're bringing up a point that's very near and dear to my heart. And I think it's one of the reasons why I got into public speaking, because I call it the Chinese menu of design. I'm sure you've heard of this.
Yeah, yeah.
Where, right? And this is what happens, and it's actually one of the things that I find, really upsetting about the design field is that designers, for whatever reason, have had a really hard time sort of establishing, how truly valuable they are to our culture, to society, to business. I mean, you think about anything that we touch, own, use, interact with, and design has to be part of that. But the problem is that design now has been sort of co-opted in a way, and designers are really not in the middle of this conversation. And I had enough years of experience dealing with somebody who would say, well, I want purple because that's the color of my tie. So
Sure.
What I did to counteract that is I learned everything I could about color. So then when they would say that, I would say, well, since you are, since you're not in if you were a leadership brand, and let me tell you about purple. Purple comes from a purple dye that was found 3,000 years ago, or 2,500 years ago in the Mediterranean, and it came from a shellfish, and you could only get one drop of purple dye from it, which is why the only people who could afford purple were the very wealthy and the church and religious organizations, because that was, and that became embedded in people's mind that purple was the color of royalty. And so I could have these conversations with people, and because I was so well versed, it was much easier to push back.
Sure.
So it wasn't, well, I think that's a really dumb idea, even if on some level you know that it's not the right thing. But this is, I think, the biggest lesson that I've learned over the years, is if you want to have a conversation where you are leading it instead of following it, you need to be super educated and you need to be super well versed in your field, so you can show just by the knowledge that you're sharing. And I look at it like every conversation is an opportunity for me to learn and for me to teach. And so when I would have these conversations with clients, little by little, I realized that I was no longer having those kinds of arguments, because they understood that they could kind of step back and let me lead the conversation. And I think what happens with newer, younger designers who haven't had that, it's harder to push back, because it really comes, and especially when, there's also this other piece, which is I need it yesterday.
Sure.
And that's of course, if things have sped up because of the web and just digital media and just in general, mobile. I mean, it used to be, it's hard to imagine there was a time when you actually had to wait like 4 days to get typed to put into a spread for a book. Like,
totally.
That's unimaginable now.
Yep. No, totally.
I don't have 5 minutes after I thought of the idea, but I sometimes actually feel that I'm very lucky that I was able to kind of come through my career in this way, because it's given me an appreciation, I think, that someone just going to school now is not going to get. And then the other piece, like I said, this is really kind of how this next pivot happened for me from design school, is I realized that I was having way too many conversations where I'm having to push back on ideas being given to me by somebody who had no understanding of what I was even doing. And so, again, you can't get in that, it's very easy actually to get in that place where, well, I'm misunderstood, and then you've got kind of the angst of the designer thing.
Yeah.
And I realized that just wasn't a happy place. And so I literally just learned. I mean, I read constantly, and I'm always looking at what's going on. In fact, every project I still go online and I look at colors, and I really understand like what every color means. And so when I have that which I know out of all the conversations, it's such a funny one to have. What I realize is that, you know, people really love the idea of being creative. And nobody, of course, would ever say, I mean, whoever tells you that they're not creative, right? Everyone's creative. And
Sure.
the reality, I think, is that everyone is creative in their own way.
Totally.
The difference is they don't always understand where their creativity can be maximized. And so what they try to do, because they don't understand the process, is they end up running the conversation. And that's something that as designers, I think, you know, it's really important to be able to say, wait a second, you know, I'm hearing what you're saying, but let me give you some background on this. So then when you're having that kind of conversation, then I think clients start to kind of relax and they realize, oh, okay, I'm talking to somebody who actually knows what they're talking about, and I can just let them do their job.
Yeah, no, I think you're bringing up a really good point, because if you can go into a client meeting and you almost basically show, okay, here's the design, here's why I laid out everything in this design, and like, you know, here's how it's going to work in the medium that you're doing design for. And I know I always go back to the web because that's the medium I know the best. And, you know, when I present something, I go in there and it's usually a prototype. And, you know, I'll click through the prototype and I'll say, well, here's how it works on a desktop. Here's how it works on a tablet. Here's how it works on a phone. So here's why we didn't do things in a certain way. Here's why we use the colors we use, you know, and you basically go in there and you say, like, I did this because of this, and this because of that, and this because of that. And like, you know, here's it working on this device. And then your target market said, based on the research that I did, or the user groups, or the focus groups, or based on my experience, or a combo of all those things, it's done like this. And, you know, let's all forget about our own personal opinions, because at the end of the day, yeah, they're relevant, but our target market isn't anybody in this room. And so, like, for example, like if you're doing something for nurses or something, and nobody in the room is a nurse, well, maybe in some cases they should hate it, right? Because they're not the target market. If you're not a nurse, you might hate it, right? And I think like that mindset is, as a designer, if you go in there and you basically can tell them, like, here's why I did everything, and it's based on research and the target market and like the medium that it's going to be for, they almost can't say like change something, because you covered all the bases. Do you agree?
Yeah, what you're actually, Kevin, what you're actually describing is called the design thinking process. That's exactly what the design process is all about. If you break it down, and I'm sure you know IDEO. I mean, this is what they talk about all the time. And what I find really interesting is that when you follow the process, you always get innovative solutions, because it cannot fail. Because if you ask and this is really how I also build my alignment workshop and how I do the kind of work I do, which is really based very much on a design model, which is first, I need to actually understand what your vision is. And the only people who know that are not the people who are the managers. Nothing against managers, no disrespect there, but it's the founders. They're the only ones who have the vision, because they're the ones who founded the company.
Totally.
So I need to get that right away. And then what I need to do, and I'm actually doing a workshop next week for a national nonprofit, and we're bringing people in from, cross disciplines. And, the idea is to kind of get everybody aligned with that, so they actually understand why their vision is meaningful to them and how they can use it in their day job, so that it feels like every time you're doing something, you're in some way supporting that vision. That piece is often overlooked, which is why so many companies, they'll work with a team, they'll work with a really good design firm or branding agency, and then they just send out like an email or put something up on the wall and says, okay, these are our core values. And, I have to tell you, the core value piece, it makes me smile, because, a core value, I mean, how many core values can you really have? You're not going to have 10. Those are not core values. Those are just how you do business. being great at customer service. Well, maybe if you're the Ritz-Carlton, because they literally wrote the book on customer service, literally and figuratively,
Sure.
because they do it as part of the DNA of their organization. But, customer service as a rule is not a core value unless you're Ritz-Carlton.
Sure.
But what you have to do is also not just find a core value that sounds good, but is actually authentic.
No,
So I'm just, right? So one of the things, and I did this, so I went back to school, actually, and I went back to grad school, and I got an MBA in strategic design from Philadelphia University, which is actually this amazing program, and they actually modeled the program after the D School, the design school at Stanford.
Oh, very cool.
So the idea is that, it's really cool, and it's the first program of its kind on the East Coast, actually. So very, very proud to be a graduate of that program. And one of the things that I learned is that there's this idea of, how do you make sure that, you really are operating from this authentic place? And it comes back to storytelling. So we worked a lot on stories, really thinking about storytelling, and, that gets into personas, and that goes directly to what you were saying about understanding your customers. So if nurses are your customers and you never talk to nurses, and more importantly, if you never watch a nurse actually doing his or her job, you have no idea what real problems they're working with. It's just an idea, something you're thinking about.
Totally.
But to really fully be able to create either a product or service or even messaging from around your hospital, or, if it's a nursing association, you need to understand a day in the life,
Totally.
and be able, right? And then the other piece, of course, is you have to be able to translate that into marketing language so that a layperson can look at that and go, got it. Like that, for me, when somebody says that to me, I know I've done a good job.
No, I think that's awesome. And I think the thing that I love about you as well is that you're so passionate about constantly learning, and you've been in this industry for a long time, right? And I think a lot of people, for lack of a better term, almost like give up on learning, and they just seem like, well, this is how I've done it forever, and I don't really care about what's new. And it's like, well, and then they wonder why they're not relevant or don't have a job in a few years, right? And that's been something that's always fascinated me. And like, I love the fact that you went back to school, that you started your own thing. And I know you've kind of mentioned kind of throughout kind of the interview that you teach. So maybe I'm kind of curious to know a bit more about exactly like what you teach, where you teach it at, because you're teaching at kind of a bunch of different places.
Yeah, so I taught in design programs for a very long time.
Right.
And then really the reason I went back to school is because my thought was that I would teach full time. So I got this MBA, and I literally went from like getting the MBA to Drexel, and they just so happened that they were starting they were launching the closed school of entrepreneurship, which is this amazing thing. So Drexel has identified that entrepreneurship is where we're all going.
Right.
And they've built it. It's the first standalone school of entrepreneurship in the United States.
That's awesome.
It has its own administrative. It's like literally a standalone. That's very unusual, right? So,
sure. And
what they're doing is actually taking it a step further, which is to integrate entrepreneurship into all of the different academic programs.
Really?
So that everyone who goes to Drexel will have to take a course in entrepreneurship, which I think is just brilliant.
Totally. So
I've really, honestly, I feel so lucky. I'm really blessed, actually. I was able to get this position. So I'm working in the School of Entrepreneurship at Drexel, and I'm working with Chuck Sacco, who's the assistant dean there, and he teaches a course called Launch It, and I've been mentoring students. This is now going to be my 4th or 5th class, and I get to work with these super passionate, super smart students who have an idea, and I help them identify their value proposition, come up with the messaging, even look at their name, and then develop their pitch deck so that they can be ready when there's a competition, pitch competition, some of them actually go on to actually have a real business. And it's just been a blast. So I've really enjoyed that. And then at the same time, I also, this last year, I started teaching in the Fox School of Business at Temple, where I teach a course on business and ethics. Right now is just an amazing time to be teaching that course because of course, what's happening with the Panama Papers. So, I think teaching for me is a way that I stay engaged with what's happening right now. And also I think working with, millennials or, with younger folks, I get older, but they stay the same age, It's really kind of a funny thing, and now that my kids are of that age, it's like, oh, okay, I get that, but they're so excited and they're so passionate, and I think it's part of what keeps me passionate about what I do, and also because I work with so many entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs by their very definition are incredibly passionate. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing.
Sure. No, I think that's awesome. And the thing that's interesting about kind of teaching, and I've done a little bit as well, and the thing that I got out of it is you almost like, yeah, you're giving them kind of, obviously you're trying to teach them stuff, but the thing that I didn't realize until I did it was you learn a lot from them as well, right? And
you do.
That's
if you're open to it, by the way.
Yeah, that's fair.
You have to be open to it, and you also have to be willing to hear what they have to say and not immediately shut them down, because that really closes the conversation very quickly. But yes, you're absolutely correct.
Sure. So I know you kind of mentioned that you're working on kind of blog posts and a book. Do you kind of want to maybe cover like the types of stuff that you kind of are covering in that or are going to cover?
Oh, yeah. So the book is something that I've been thinking about writing a book literally for 5 years.
Okay.
And one of the things that came out of my graduate program is that I finally decided, okay, I'm going to write this book.
Okay.
And so at first it was really going to be more about my experience and the many companies I've worked with. And then I realized that would make it too much about me. And what I really love about my job is that I get to help other people be successful, and that they are telling me their stories, and my job is really to translate that and to give them, sort of their best self, if you will.
Sure.
And so I decided that what I needed to do was that I was going to interview entrepreneurs, and to date I've interviewed 17.
That's awesome.
And
Congrats.
my goal is, thank you. Yeah, it's actually been awesome, and people have been so helpful, and I'm reaching out to people on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm at as of today, I'm at 1630 followers on Twitter.
Well, that's awesome.
Which for me that's a huge accomplishment, because I literally only got on Twitter a year ago.
Sure. No, that's awesome. Like, to be fair, that's how I get most of my guests for the show, is LinkedIn and
right,
Twitter.
That's how you and I connected. I forgot. That's right.
Yeah, like that's how you and I met. So I
Exactly.
love that, right? And the fact that we live in different countries and across the, in different parts of the world is like, I love that, right? And that's what I love about doing the show as well, is just being able to connect with people and have conversations with people about, well, in your case, like design, right? I love that. And it sounds like you share kind of the same passion when you've been interviewing other people.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. I mean, my job, it's interesting, because having been on the other end of that, one of the things that I ask every person that I speak to is what advice would you give other entrepreneurs?
Sure.
And the thing that, part of course, what I'm going to do is to synthesize all the responses. And, I've got a framework. There's going to be 10 chapters, and each chapter is going to be dealing with another aspect of some, misconceptions perhaps, or some ideas around marketing. And then, but really for me, the book is the stories of these entrepreneurs.
That's awesome.
And what I'm enjoying so much about it is, what I hear over and over again is exactly what I hoped I would hear, that would, I guess going into it, thinking about some of the things that I had witnessed. One is, I wish I'd started sooner.
Sure.
And the other one is, I wish I'd done a better job identifying my target market and identifying who actually was our target, right, and what they really wanted. Because, we spent, in fact, I just had a conversation not too long ago with an entrepreneur who ended up closing their business, even though they were hugely successful. But they couldn't scale it because it turned out that they had been marketing to the wrong customer all along. Like they thought they had a strategic partnership, and they spent a lot of money and a lot of time developing messaging that in the end didn't get them what they wanted because they weren't actually saying things like the right thing to the right person at the right time. You know,
wow, that's interesting.
I found that really, really compelling. That really the beginning, and this is kind of at the core of my book. And in fact, I'm writing a blog post specifically on this, which is on personal brand, because in the beginning, you know, the founder is the brand.
Sure.
And so, what founders don't realize is that their story is what makes them different. Why they started a company is what people actually want to know this. Because especially one of the things I find so interesting about millennials as a group, and you know, of course, I'm generalizing here, but
sure.
That certainly has been my experience with my students, that they really, truly care about the brands they buy, the brands they associate themselves with, and they actually want to know what these people believe. They want to know what they do, how they treat their employees, how they treat people abroad, and how, you know, what the supply chain looks like. And, you know, they're really concerned about this. And so, to me, authenticity is such a big part of branding that what founders don't realize is they've got this already right here, and they're not even tapping into it. And then the other piece that I find really interesting is that they will hire an intern to build their social media feed. Now, to me, that makes absolutely no sense because social media is the way that it's our elevator pitch, right? We no longer have elevators. We have platforms.
Sure.
We have Facebook, we have Twitter, we have LinkedIn. That's our opportunity for elevator pitches. And so what owners are actually doing is they're handing that over to someone who doesn't know their story, and then they're trusting a 25-year-old to somehow be able to tell their story in a way that's meaningful and relevant. And I just find that, you know, I just don't think that's a good idea. You know, in my book, one of the things that I'm going to talk about is kind of the role of social media. And in my viewpoint, it really, especially if you're trying to build thought leadership, and certainly in the B2B world, it's really important that the owner either is writing the content or is working with a professional copywriter to create the content.
No, I think that's really good advice. So I know you're still working on it, but have you kind of picked a tentative release date or month and a title?
So, you know, it's funny. I thought I had the title.
All right.
The title has changed dramatically, but what I'm actually describing, or what I'm hoping this will be, is the companion piece to the Lean Startup.
Okay.
Which is a book by Eric Ries, and the whole lean business model movement, which was actually started by Steve Blank, who's a very successful serial entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. And there's lots of articles about lean marketing. As I've been doing research on it. But for me, it's like I want to write the book. The book for me is, you know, what do you do those first 3 years when you're starting a business? Because year 1 to 3 are so critical. And by the time you get to year 5, if you're going to make it, right? Because of course we know, I think it's like 95% of startups fail in the first year. It's really high.
Yep.
And so part of, I guess, what kind of motivates me is that I'd like to maybe have a little bit to do with maybe changing that. And I think understanding marketing and understanding the power of social media and the power of, you know, good messaging and really a strong branding presence is huge. I mean, if you think about any power brand, I mean, even Nike, you know, I'm sure you know what Nike, the name means and
sure.
You know, all of that, but you know, Nike didn't get, and you know, it's funny because I actually use them in one of my blog posts, which I call the Nike syndrome, because of so many companies say, and I've heard this, well, you know, we're not as big as Nike, so basically, you know, somehow marketing gets left off the table because we don't have that kind of money.
Sure.
And the reality is that it took Nike 20 years to become Nike.
Yeah, no, totally.
And had they started early, like I'm hearing and talking to these entrepreneurs, it wouldn't have taken them 20 years.
Totally.
So this is my, you know, my own kind of anecdotal evidence has been that in fact, the role of lean marketing and the role that I hope my book will have in the success of entrepreneurs is to stop asking the question that we'll do it when we have money, which I hear all the time. Yeah, when we have money, we'll do marketing. But that's the wrong question to be asking. It's not when will I have money, but what do I need to do now so I'm prepared when I'm ready to scale up my business?
Totally.
Because most entrepreneurs, right? I mean, whether you end up being acquired or, you sell, I mean, there's a lot of entrepreneurs, certainly in the tech world, it's like, oh, we want someone to buy us for $2 billion. Well, how do you think that's going to happen?
Totally.
So I'd like marketing to take its rightful place in that equation.
Well, and there's a lot of ways to market yourself that don't have to cost you like an arm and a leg, right? Like, I think that's what people forget, right?
And they also, I think, forget the role of marketing. See, to me, this is why I'm writing this book, because for me, the role of marketing in the beginning has nothing to, it's really not what's going to happen later.
Sure.
One of the things that I love about that Steve Blank actually said is that startups are not just smaller versions of bigger companies. They're completely different animals, a completely different ecosystem. You can't, this is why the lean startup was written, because people, were used to these very antiquated, very long, writing a business plan that takes a year. By the time you start implementing it, your entire market has changed and you've missed the windows, because we now live in a world where things are happening so fast.
Totally.
So I would love to see, but he doesn't talk about marketing at all, or the value of branding. I mean, branding to me, if you're going to spend any money, don't spend it on a logo in the first 6 months of your business. People agonize over this, and since I work with a lot of startups, one of the first things I say to them, I say, you know what? Why don't you wait until you actually know what it is you've built, and then hire a professional. Don't get a logo for $19 on
Sure.
the web. And hire someone who really knows what they're doing to build you a true identity that could take you for the next 20 years. But in the beginning, what you should really be focusing is identifying what is this thing that you've built. And one of the people that I was my go-to is Simon Sinek. Do you know him?
Yeah. Well, of him,
So
I should say.
Yeah, I love him. I actually got to meet him. He was here at the Ritz-Carlton in Philadelphia, and I had the really pleasure of meeting him. And it was like I don't know, like some kind of semi-god walking into the room. He was literally like the crowd parted.
That's awesome.
It was really something. He was great. I really enjoyed talking to him. But what I find really interesting about it, what he talks about is this whole idea that people don't buy what you sell, they buy why you sell it. And this why is one of the hardest things to do well. And, he actually, I mean, I'm sure you've seen his TED Talk, which I think is like the number 1 and number 2 of all time.
Yeah, it's up there, yeah.
On YouTube. I don't know how many million hits he's gotten on it, but what I love about that is, when he talks about Apple, I mean, we talk about, well, why is Apple so expensive? Well, one of the aspects, and this is actually part of the research I've done, I've read a lot about, of course, how you build brands, and David Acker, who I believe teaches in the Kellogg School of Business, so he's written several books on branding. He's also on YouTube, and he says that being expensive is actually connected to your brand. And if you are a luxury brand and you can show that and people believe it and they see it and you create that kind of experience, the expectation is that it needs to be more expensive. Sure. And in a way, you think about it, if a MacBook was $500, I don't know if we'd value it as much.
No, totally. You're right.
And plus, what you're buying is not just the guts of it, but all the engineering that went into it, the R&D that went into the ease of use. I mean, that's one of the things that Apple is really known for, is that because they put design at the core of that experience.
Totally.
And they always have. And in fact, one of the things many years ago I said, I can't remember where I saw this study, but there was actually, I'm sure there have been several, studies done that show that if you take everything else being equal, and the only differentiator is in design, in other words, that the organization uses design as a core principle, they are always more successful than the ones that don't.
No, No, I totally agree with you. I think that's really good advice, and I kind of love your take on kind of the whole space and the whole kind of industry, and that's really why I wanted to have you on the show. But we're kind of coming to the end of the show, so do you want to maybe close the show with promoting where people can kind of find you online?
Great. So, thank you. Yeah. So, would love for people to follow me on Twitter, and that's just hashtag, or I guess it's hashtag. It's Orly. It's just Orly Zeewy, my whole name, ORLYZEEWY. One of the great things about having an unusual name is it's really easy to get URLs.
Sure. No, that's awesome.
So, and then my website is just simply zeewy.com.
Perfect. Well, I really appreciate.
And then I'm on LinkedIn.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, sorry. The only other thing is, like I said, so I'm on LinkedIn, and once I have my book further along, then I'm going to set up a Facebook page.
Sure.
And to finish up with that, so my goal is by the end of June to pitch it to publishers.
Okay.
And hopefully by the fall having it in production, so that I could have it maybe beginning of 2017 or end of 2016. That's my goal. We'll have to wait and see, but I'm trying to sort of stick to that schedule.
Sure. No, that's awesome. And I love the fact that, you kind of, we talk about stuff that isn't necessarily out just yet, and kind of what you've been going through with naming changes and whatnot. I love that. Right. And I love the real side of building something. Right. And that's really cool. But, I do appreciate, you taking the time out of your busy schedule to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and I'm excited to check out the book when it comes out.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, maybe you can bring me back and I can tell you more about it. Once I actually figure out, all the ins and outs of it, it's still, like you said, it's a process, it's in the works. So
sure, that's awesome.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I really appreciate being asked to be on the show, and I've enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, it was awesome. Yeah, thanks again, and we'll talk soon.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. The music for the show is done by Electric Mantra. You can check them out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.